Hey guys, this is your last unit lecture video. This is on unit 3 from pages 1069 through I think around 1090, and this is the Norton Anthology. This is my companion lecture, and we're covering American Lit since 1945. Now, that's a lot of content. We're 25 years away from covering an entire century's worth of content. So we're talking about 75 years. I think that eventually, in some future, the Norton is going to have to break up all of this literature content. There's a lot to cover. There's a lot that we're going to talk about in this unit that, Norton defines as postmodernism and says, there's so many different things that postmodernism can cover, and under the umbrella of postmodernism, Norton doesn't necessarily talk about all of this, but there's all these other subcategories. And so we're really, in our introduction here, we're really looking at like a broad view of an overall aesthetic, an overall form of writing, an overall classification, and I think that it's a very general discussion. So I think of all of our units, this one is the most broad and overarching, simply because it's covering so much content. I mean, if you juxtapose this between what we just looked at, we were just looking at 30 years last unit. This unit, we're looking at something like 75. All right, so, my usual disclaimer is just that you guys have a quiz on this content. That quiz comes directly from the reading itself. I hope that this lecture functions as a way for you to better understand that reading and some of the content that we're looking at, but I might not cover everything in the quiz. So please make sure that you read the unit introduction before you take the quiz. Otherwise, you might not do as well as you would like. Okay, so again, like usual, I'm just kind of chunking these out into the different sections that Norton already automatically categorizes the overall unit into. First, we have this little introduction where a lot of what the editors are talking about in this section is that first kind of example of our idea of postmodern writing and what it's about. This section talks about the idea of like what feels truly new in American writing. Okay, so how are we going to distinguish between modernism and postmodernism? And really there's not one clear-cut answer. At one point in like later on in the unit, Norton talks about postmodernism as really just kind of like long modernism. A lot of what modernist writing was doing, postmodernist writing was also doing. So what is it, like what's the difference? What is new now after 1945? And one of those things that our text identifies is the idea of multilingualism. Here we have this idea of the mestizo or the borderlands, so kind of like when two languages blend together. I've got if you look at these slides yourself, I have, and I just realized I'm not actually presenting these. You guys can see pretty much everything here. But if you look at, there we go. If you look at these slides yourself, you can click on that underlined word mestizo, and that's going to take you to this idea of like the borderlands. Gloria Anzaldúa talks about the mestiza, the borderlands, this space where two cultures, two languages, two social areas like meet up, and how to exist in that. And that's what our textbook talks about. Like, it's okay to just exist in that borderland space. You don't have to justify it. It can just be this blend. And so that's one of the things our book identifies as kind of like what's new in American writing. We have this blend between what's academic and what's popular. So, we're getting into kind of like this question of, do we need to continue to focus on literary form? does that sort of like highly studied aspect of writing still matter? And how, if we do want to still focus on that, how do we also make it popular? How does what's popular influence our writing? How does what's academic influence our writing? And those things are really important questions to our postmodern era of writing. One of the quotes that I thought was really kind of noteworthy from this part of the text is, our book says, 21st century readers live these intersections daily, code shifting as they move among family, friends, school, work, nations, and cultures. And I think this is really interesting because, even recently we still talk about this idea of code shifting, which is that when you're with your family, you tackle a certain type of language, you use a certain type of language, you take on that language. When you're with your friends, you might still be speaking English, that's not what I mean, but you're talking with a particular lingo. At school, there's a certain space that's looking for a particular, formality, yet learning in informal kind of language, something with work. And so it's kind of like this idea where you are a different person linguistically depending on where you're at in your life. That's the idea of code shifting, just like changing your language and how you speak a little bit depending on who you're at, like who you're with, where you're at. And I think that that's not only something that our readers like right after 1945 were thinking about, but it's something that we still think about today. It's a practice we still do. And I would say it's not necessarily new to 1945, but our writers are using that in their own writing. We're not really ever getting away from that idea that we got with naturalism, where, the jargon of a particular place or social context or person is used, where that is almost like celebrated even more, and kind of is helping to define this idea of postmodernism. Writing of this time held an artistic urge to experiment, and you'll read in the introduction and throughout this whole chapter about the different ways in which our authors are experimenting with writing, experimenting with how they're viewing the world, experimenting with drugs to help them experiment how they view the world, experimenting socially and sexually and writing about those types of experiments, experimenting with traditional form in different mediums. So journalism, film, poetry. We get spoken poetry, spoken word poetry as opposed to and in addition to written poetry. All of those types of experiments with form are happening now. Also, changing demographics influenced 1945 and up literature. So new forms of immigration. And our book mentions, it's not just immigration now that's going to influence writing, it's immigration to come that's going to influence writing, and it covers this idea. One of the other concepts that I think is covered in the next section, and I'll get to in a little bit, is, the idea of changing demographics for military members. We're in the post-war era now. World War II is over in the time period that we're reading. And so how are all of those military men coming back? How is that affecting reading? That's one of the changing demographics that we'll kind of get to in the next slide. So our next section is new readers, new writers, new heroes. New readers were more diverse and better educated. More people were going to college from across, social and class lines. Many new readers had been in military service. We're looking at like with the ability to publish paperback books in a mass way, our military service members during their service are getting, all these books and reading them overseas and getting access to them and then bringing those ideas home, bringing what they read. At some point, The Great Gatsby goes away in popularity and comes back because of the way that paperbacks are distributed, and how people can get their hands on them. it allows more people to get access to textbooks to books because they're not going to cost as much. You can make these like super cheap paperback novels. As far as sort of like a connection between that, the GI Bill allows for an influx of first generation college students, where maybe someone could not have gone to college before. They went to the military, they served their years, and now they get the GI Bill, which gives them 4 years of college. And that allows in 1947, 49% of college students were veterans. That's like half. Half of college students in 1947 were veterans, made possible in part at least by the GI Bill. This lifts millions out of the middle, like up into the middle class. So again, you had maybe some men who were in a low class. They go into the military. They're done with their enlistment period. They get the GI Bill, they go to college, they get a job that maybe they couldn't have gotten because they never could have paid for college or found access to college without going into the military, without having access to that GI Bill. And now they're able to kind of like step up into that middle class and take their generation up higher. And so you have, again, if we talked about changing demographics, that's another example of that. Some other things that this chapter or this part of the chapter covers is a critical method called new criticism. This is the type of criticism that I think most literature instructors kind of prioritize, especially for new writers, and that's close reading of a text. So, you think back to that Nabokov reference at the beginning of the section where Nabokov is quizzing his students, saying like, what makes a reader a good reader, gives all these options, and none of the options are correct, which feels a little rude, but, eventually he's like, actually the right answer is having a dictionary, and being able to annotate the text. And that's the idea of close reading, is like looking at the text. What do the words mean? What are the connotations of these words? What are the denotations of these words? How can we connect the words? Like, what's the artistic form here? Really digging into the text, forgetting about the history of the author, forgetting about social conventions, not looking at those types of things, but looking at the text. What is the text telling us? And how does knowing language and words and word patterns and forms help us understand the text? That's the new critical, theory of interpretation. And that is sort of like Nabokov wants all students of literature to focus on that and to kind of let go of these other forms of how we can interpret a text, like what's going on in society at the time the text was written, what happened in the author's backstory or background that makes them, write a text in a certain way. Despite this new criticism, though, the idea of connecting with a particular character or identifying with a particular character, the idea of looking at your own society through the lens of a text and vice versa, looking at a text through the lens of your own society, is so ingrained in readers that, Nabokov's whole desire to switch purely to new criticism, it's just not going to work. American readers are not just readers of form. They're readers who apply the text to their lives and apply their lives to a text. There's baggage, right? So that idea is wonderful. It's a great way to read a text, but it's not the only way. And readers are kind of both excited about this new criticism and also unwilling to let go of the past of literary theory. And that's okay. And that creates beautiful ways to interpret literature. New readers also read to remake themselves and their society. We get an example of James Baldwin, and the text talks about Sonny's Blues, which I don't think we're going to read, but it's in the text and it's worth reading. Absolutely. James Baldwin is an example of African-American writing as social critiques on racism. Of course, we're going to get a lot of that. There's plenty of texts that are in the textbook that cover this concept. Again, like I said before, American writers of this time are not just going to let go of using literature to talk about society. They're and they're not just going to focus on form in the text. They're going to use literature to critique society and vice versa. We have these social liberation movements that inspire writing with like your anti-hero, your misfit character, someone who is not going to conform to society and standards. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I think, is the big example that we get here. Like I mentioned before, writers use drugs to broaden their thinking. That's kind of a big popular thing at the time. You get like the beat poets with their use of peyote. Our textbook doesn't really talk too much about that. I think our textbook talks about like a lot of writers using LSD to just get some really wild mental processes going. In all of this, you know, contemporary American writing at this time celebrates the outsider. One of the things before I get into this next slide that our textbook doesn't really talk about, but I think is worth noting is during the 60s. So in this postmodern period, during the 60s, we get the rise of, or the creation of the genre of young adult fiction. I'm just kind of like going on, our book doesn't really talk specifically about this, but I think it's worth noting. It's something that I studied. We didn't really have this like key category or genre of fiction called young adult before about the 60s, but you start to see that, and you can see that now, how in that time period, or like how our literature, you know, Barnes and Noble has an entire section for young adult fiction. And I think it's worth, like, one of the things I hope Norton will do in the future is just kind of talk more about that, because that's a big thing that was happening at this time that isn't covered in the textbook. And I think it's just kind of interesting to keep an eye on that. Okay, the next section is literature, and I've got modern media here. It's actually American media. Two major modern media developments are happening in this time. Right after World War II, we get the rise of television. And then a few decades later, we get the internet in the 90s. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture video, I really think that Norton's eventually going to have to kind of grapple with like I could see two distinct sections here, 1945 through about 1990, and then 1990 until wherever we are now. I think that we have these big differences. Once the internet happens, there's a whole new area that we need to talk about, and our book just kind of covers both of them in the same section, and I think eventually that's not going to be enough. But those are two big things. Television and the internet. Again, 1945, 1990, we have a big kind of split there. Another idea that our textbook gives us to kind of consider, something that our textbook considers, something that the critics of the time are considering, is this idea that the medium is the message. What that means is that how something is communicated is sometimes the very essence of what it communicates. And I read this a couple of times. I think I'm still processing exactly what this means, but I think the idea is that picking a form, because there are now so many forms for telling a story, film, television, poetry, drama, fiction, nonfiction, all of the genres that come out of fiction, all of those things. So picking a form, the medium is the message, is purposeful. If you're picking television, you're telling that story on television, and the fact that you picked television is a message in and of itself. One of the examples here that our textbook covers is the idea of television delivering a culture of performance. Like, we sit down and we're entertained in our homes by watching television every night, whether that's the news or whether that's like a short skit. And I think that, there's this idea that if you pick a certain medium, a certain form to tell your story, the form that you pick is a message in and of itself. The other thing that our book talks about regarding television is this concept of passivity. And one of the things that, I mean, it talks about like breaking the fourth wall, which is television, film, and drama, and even poetry and fiction. Honestly, any communication medium, is the idea of breaking the fourth wall, I think, is the response to the problem or the question of passivity. But the question or problem of passivity is the idea that if you are a viewer and you are watching, particularly on television, the horrors of war or the social injustice or the social unrest, what is your role? So you're seeing this happening. The news is giving you this information. Are you allowed to just passively sit by and digest that? Or is there something that you need to do about it, about what you're seeing or reading? I think that we have always had this possible problem. Readers have read about injustices decades, centuries ago, and responded to it if they had the means. But I'm wondering if the reason our textbook is really identifying this now as a problem is because of just how much content is pushed out. You know, you've got the news, like our book mentions, with the Vietnam War being like the first televised war. You have that kind of news. And it's so instant. It's at the very least more instant than it was a century ago. So there's this question of like, are you allowed to watch and do nothing? What's up with that? And so I think the response from communication medium standpoint is, well, let's break the fourth wall. So let's talk directly to the viewer. Let's address the audience right to their face. And you're going to see that in film. We still see that. We see this all the time in film and on TV, where a character will look right at the camera and talk to the audience. And then we see this, we've seen this again centuries ago whenever your writer says, "Dear reader," or "What do you think, dear reader?" This is nothing new, but we're kind of starting to grapple with that a little bit, and you're going to see it happen more and more. So they're breaking that fourth wall by pulling the audience in so that they cannot be a passive viewer or a passive reader. It's very intentional when they're breaking the fourth wall. Something else that's going on at this time, public poetry readings are growing in popularity. I think that our book talks about Allen Ginsberg reading Howl as kind of one of the most notable instances. Now, we're not reading Howl this semester. I think that I encourage you to read Howl, Howl, but I think that it takes some additional literature study to really be able to analyze it, and to be okay with it. It certainly was and is still probably controversial in nature. So that's not why we're not reading it. I think it's just, it can be shocking at times. And unless you're really ready to analyze it, then it's not really worth it. I think that that's kind of the thing there. But public poetry readings are growing in popularity. And film is intersecting the most with storytelling. What that means is that, like, novels are most often being adapted into film. Stories are most often being adapted into film, and that is not going to change. Pretty much any movie or TV show that you watch these days, you can find the book because it was a book first. This is kind of like something that's becoming a phenomenon, and it still hasn't changed. Let's see, the next section is experiment and play in the 20th and 21st century literature. Our book starts talking to us about this label, postmodern. And again, modern and postmodern do have a blend. It's not like postmodern is this big shift where it's completely different from modernism. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities, but ultimately postmodernism refers to anything aesthetically edgy or off-kilter. I've got some typos here. Sorry guys. Blends, genres, or cultural registers. Comments on the general disorder of media in contemporary culture. There's just like a lot of chaos at this time. And most of our 1950, like year 1950 and on works are given this label. Again, there's a lot of other ways in which now we can label this. Our book is covering so much content, and it's kind of just chunking it all into postmodern. I don't think that's really fair anymore, but it's fair enough for the purposes of this being an introductory class. Fiction is giving this openness to interpretation. So it's like, how does the reader want to interpret this? Again, like I mentioned before, American readers cannot just say it's about the text and only about the text. They're bringing their personal baggage to the table when they're reading. They're bringing society's baggage to the table. They're interested in what the author's baggage is. There's so many different ways that you can analyze fiction, and a lot of our texts are kind of dealing with this, and our critics are dealing with this as well. Poetry reconsiders and gives new meaning to the material world. Like, a lot of poetry is trying to understand almost like consumerism, like, why do these objects in our lives matter? It's interesting because now it is okay for a poem to just kind of like cover some random topic like an onion maybe. And it doesn't have to be this like grandiose idea. And so poetry is dealing with form and content on this kind of like experimental level. Also, poetry is forgetting about traditional form. And our book kind of talks about a couple of poets who had traditional books of poetry and then went to this more free verse, chaotic looking type of poetry, that the goal is to kind of reflect the distracted mind rather than like, let's only focus on this muse, or let me call my muse to figure out what is this window in my bedroom doing, or something like that. It's poetry now is kind of like taking on this free form, or almost this like stream of consciousness, this free verse where the poet can just consider all of these different things within the same poem. And that again gives openness to interpretation. Like, how does the reader want to uncover what's going on with the poet's mind? So maybe we're going to come back to Freud here. Our book doesn't talk about that, but it gives us an opportunity to come back to Freud and to say, well, what's going on with the writer, and how can we make what's going on with the writer by looking at their language make sense for this poem? Modern literature influences postmodern writing. I've said it before. They're not completely separate. They're definitely overlapping. Our book at this point talks about this idea of long modernism, just kind of offering a synonym to postmodernism. Let's see. And because of that, our book mentions that it can be difficult to identify exactly what postmodernism is. Literature now is our last section. Literature today is defined by its global audience, its massive production, and its traditional use of English. Sorry, not traditional, transnational, meaning English is sort of becoming a language that multiple countries are able to read in and speak in. Literature today is interpreted and explored in new social contexts as it's published in multiple countries and languages. So you're not just getting American lit in America, you're getting American lit all over the world. And again, remember, we're not just thinking about 1945. We're thinking about 1945 until today. Web formats, privileged shorter forms of writing. You guys have experience with this. Think about how short our videos are on YouTube. Think about how short our tweets are, our social media posts, all short content, which isn't to say that our book is talking about social media like that, but you can see the kind of overlap there. And finally, I'm going to end with this quote. Language itself is a living thing, an artistic medium that changes in the very hands of the writers and speakers who use it. I like this because I think that it's worth thinking. Literature will always change. Language will always change. Forms will always change. What is traditional now will be old school, or, some version of pre-modern 400 years from now. So I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. What was English 2,000 years ago is not English today. And the like writing and language and the very words that we speak are different than they were years ago. And I think that that's really, really important. So hopefully this makes sense. If you guys have any questions, please send me an email.